Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our week of weekly tips and mentoring and sharing advice. I encourage you to send in any questions or on chat or beforehand, any questions that you have that I can help on. But our mission statement is having fun, improving lives. And that's the purpose of this webinar, is having fun, improving lives. And I'm going to take you back to some lessons I learned long ago, 55 years ago, when I started working at H&R Block. Remember what happened, that my dad was a frustrated entrepreneur and he always wanted to be in business for himself, but he had too many children too quickly, and we were poor and he couldn't afford it. So in 1969, when I was at the University of Buffalo, he called up H&R Block, and he was the CFO of a public company. He decided that he would like to buy a H&R Block franchise that he and I could run together. And we lived in a suburb called Hamburg, and they said, well, we're going to open a company store there. Maybe your son could take our course and work for us. And so I joined in November of 1969. I joined a class late, a accelerate class, and I believe it was about 6 or 8 weeks, and I was a week or two late. But I joined it, and I just loved the tax course. I loved everything about it. It was challenging. It was there was gray areas that you could interpret the law and make decisions on benefits of customers, and I just always loved debating, arguing, and then it was mathematical. Back in 1969, not only did we not have computers, we didn't have calculators. You had to pull the hand of an add machine. And so my ability to, one of my gifts is my mathematical skills, and adding, dividing, multiplying, subtracting, I'm just faster than virtually anyone. And so I often, it was funny, when I was preparing returns, I was often the customers were more impressed by the fact of my math skills than my digging for deductions and helping them get the lowest taxes. But I learned very quickly that, as a preparer, that for most people, or many people, going to the tax return was like going to the dentist. It was unpleasant. And so just the easing their pain and getting them through it was, even if in the ones that we couldn't save money for, it was incredibly rewarding. So I went to work, loved it. I was working every night, and during the tax season, while I was at school, went to school during the day, and every night and weekend for 15 weeks, I did taxes. And I was, again, I loved the job because it was helping people, and because it was, again, it was legal, and it was sort of, when you do a tax return, and certainly a complicated tax return, it's like putting a puzzle together in a way. And you get to at least give the customer options, that this is you can do this or this, and this is what we recommend. So, and again, it appealed to my mathematical skills. So I loved the job, loved the tax preparation industry, and I was so blessed. One of my very many blessings was that now at 20 years old, I found out what I wanted to be the rest of my life. And I've interviewed thousands of people in my career, and most of them don't know what they want to be when they grow up. More than half of the people, and that's one of the questions I always ask, is what do you want to be when you grow up? And more than half don't, at any age, 20, 30, 40, 50 don't know what they want to be when they grow up. And I found out, you know what, I wanted to be in tax preparation. And that was, of course, 55 years ago. And now it's served me pretty well. So I ended the first tax season and happy. Came back in the second season, and now I had realized that on a commission basis, that the offices I had worked at two first-year offices in Hamburg, New York, and East Aurora, New York, and they were brand new. So the volume was low compared to the offices that had been there for a number of years up in Buffalo. And so I actually took some hours I tried to grab hours in the busier office, because we were paid, not that we were paid minimum wage, but as a bonus against the percentage of the tax preparation that was charged. And in my second season, my manager, they came to me on January 31st, and my manager had been put in the hospital. They thought he had a heart attack. Well, this is now January 31st, 1971. They hadn't invented anxiety attacks back then. He actually only had anxiety attacks, but they thought he had a heart attack. And so they put him in the hospital, and they said he was going to be in there. They didn't know how long he was going to be in there. And they came to me, the regional director and a troubleshooter actually came down from Toronto, came in and sat me down and said, would you leave school and manage these 10 offices that were doing about 10,000 returns, had about 75 employees. And so now they had recognized my leadership potential, even though I was just 21 years old, and virtually all the employees were in their 40s or 50s. They picked me as the person that was most capable of running those offices. So I talked to my parents, and they said, sure, go for it. And a little bit surprising, but I did. And so now I was running 10 offices, and the problem was that my manager had been incompetent, and we had hundreds and hundreds of tax returns that were due. When you did a tax return back in those days, you would tell the customer, well, you can come back in typically, as I recall, it was 7 days. In 7 days, we will process your return, check it, process it, copy, and produce a copy for you and a copy to mail to the government. Because, of course, there was no such thing as computer filing then. And when I went to the processing center, the headquarters, there was hundreds and hundreds stacked high. I mean, there were table after table stacked high, almost to the ceiling, with tax returns that hadn't been processed. And so I was faced with that immediate problem. Not only were we in the busiest time of the season, preparing more returns per day than almost any other point during the tax season, that the first week of February is one of two busiest weeks of the taxes, because people come in early who want their money quickly, and the due date when W-2s had to be given to employees is January 31st. So all W-2s had hit the street, and we were just mobbed in our offices, but we also had to process those returns. Well, fortunately, they weren't all due. They weren't all due that day, all those hundreds of returns, but unfortunately, they were behind. And so I had to mobilize and solve that problem while we're handling masses of customers in our offices. We were doing about 400 customers a day. And we had to face that 7 days from now, we're going to have their returns ready. So I mobilized and solved the problem. And looking back, it's a little bit surprising that I was able to have the respect of all the employees. And I did get along with all the employees and had great relationships. And they were most grateful that I had. Not only did I treat them well and listen to them and work with them in scheduling, but I produced. I got them their returns checked and processed them back to them. We did what we said we were going to do, and so now the customers were happy. Well, when they found out that my manager had, by the way, they had promised. The promise was, if he doesn't come back, this will be your district. But if he does, then we'll find a place for you. And so this was, again, the regional director, George Gunderson, and the troubleshooter that they sent in nationally and internationally. And he came back to work, and now he was jealous of me because I had solved the problem, and the employees looked up to me, and he was sort of now he wasn't needed. And yet he was in charge. He was older, and he was in charge. It was his district, and I was getting all of the acclaim or the good relationships with the employees. Well, he went to George Gunderson and said, when the April 15th came, before April 15th, he went to George Gunderson and said, John doesn't get along with the employees. They don't like him, and he's not doing a good job at employee retention, employee morale. So I was passed over and told, well, I was laid off. So now April 30th, I'm laid off and looking for something to do. Well, I went through a sort of into the desert for my biblical into the desert for some period of time, and I was kind of a bum from April 30th of 1971 until September of 75. For about 4 years, I was bumming it along. And one of the lessons I learned is that when I evaluate people, and you typically evaluate people on what they've done in their life up to that point. But what I learned is that if the person hasn't found themselves, if they haven't found their love, if they haven't found their proper position, then you have to take that into account. I had for a few months, I was in the right job, the right position, going in the right direction. And that was ripped away from me. And so I was somewhat directionless from that period until I became a full-time employee again in September of 75. So what I did and I collected unemployment up until tax season. And I had found a poker game at the University of Buffalo while I was there. And the students weren't that good at poker players, but we played for nickel chips. But I would make money playing poker. I would collect unemployment, and then so I went back during the next tax season, and George Gunderson, not only was I not promoted, but George Gunderson was demoted, and there were 3 districts in Buffalo, and he was demoted into one of the other districts. So the guy that had undermined me, Phil Rutenstra, was still in one of the districts, and George was put into a different district, the largest district in Buffalo, and that had the largest office and the largest number of returns. And he was looking around for assistant manager. I applied, and he hired me. Well, there were 2 major features with George Gunderson. Number one, he was a literal chain smoker, and one of the few people ever. A chain smoker is someone literally who he smokes a cigarette, and as the cigarette is burning out, he takes it and starts the next cigarette. So it was almost it was very unusual to see him without a cigarette in his mouth, because he just went, as long as he was awake, it seemed he had a cigarette in his mouth. If he wasn't eating, he was smoking, and he was, of course, the cigarette was burning while he was eating. So but in addition to that, he was a alcoholic, turns out, or became an alcoholic at some point in that time. And so I was left on my own to run that district most of the tax season, because as an alcoholic, and because I was capable, because I'd done it before, and that's my forte, I was running the district, and he would stay home most of the time. Of course, back then they didn't have cell phones, and they didn't have iPads or computers to communicate. You just communicated with a phone. So he didn't communicate that much with me, but he said over and over again what a huge mistake he had made by not promoting me to be a district manager. He said, I'm going to recommend you to my boss that you should, after the end of this season, you should become a district manager. Well, one of the lessons I learned that I really didn't implement well until while I was in that season as assistant manager at Block, my friend who I met in 1970 and still my friend today, Gordon D'Angelo, he became a tax preparer. And what we used to do is we used to not only check the returns for accuracy, but we checked the return to make sure that the pricing was the appropriate pricing. Well, as the assistant manager, they brought me one of Gordon's returns. He was at a branch office, not in my office, so we didn't see each other during work hours very much. And he had done a tax return, and he had back then the average fees were very low. I would say the average fee was maybe $12 an hour. I'm sorry, $12 a tax return. That compares with 2024, 53 years later, where it's $250. So think of it as $12 a tax return. And Gordon had done a somewhat complicated tax return for a guy. Then they said the fee should be, I forget the exact fee, it should be $26, and he charged $43. So we called him up and said, Gordon, you need to call the customer and tell him we're going to refund him $17. And this is where I had the incredible lesson that I didn't capitalize on immediately. It took me many years to understand its importance. But he had, as he was going through the returns, it had some complicated issues that were save the customer money. So when he owned his own home, so he could itemize his deductions. So when he did the return, he said, John, I don't know how I'm going to possibly tell the guy I'm going to refund his money. He was so happy, he tipped me $20. So he charged $43 for a $26 tax return. In our mind, it was worth $26. He charged $43 and the customer gave him a $20 tip. He says, how am I going to go back to him and say, we overcharged you by $17? And what he had done very skillfully is, as he did each form that added fees to the customer, he said, this Schedule A, itemizing your deductions because you own your home, is going to save you $652. And then he said, we can, because your income has gone up dramatically over the last 5 years, and back then they had something called income averaging, I'm going to be able to save you another $472. So he got the customer so excited during the process that the customer was happy. He exceeded the customer's expectations. And the customer was overjoyed to give him $63, including the $20 tip, because he saw how Gordon had saved him well over $1,000. And we invented a program many years later. I didn't do this when I didn't really come up with a method of we talked about that, and we preached that, and we trained that you should that's the way you should treat customers. But it wasn't until we got to Liberty that some of our franchisees in our training department said, let's have a film called Closing the Sale. And we went to some of we went to 2 or 3 of our best franchisees at Liberty Tax. And now this is 30 years later. We went to some of our best franchisees and said, and filmed a whole film on the Gordon D'Angelo method that I'm sure was practiced by numerous people, but it had never been put in a film and immortalized until 30 years later. Now, there was a black and white film back when I first started that you had to take when you went in for training. And it was interesting because back then, you had to wear a tie and a suit when you did tax returns, when you worked as a preparer. And it was called Mr. How Who Doesn't Know Why. I would love to see that film 55 years later, but it was all black and white. And this poor Mr. How, and the fees he didn't know why his average fee was lower than the office. So back then you would publish the average fee of each preparer, and some preparers were $12.10, and another was $11.84. His was the lowest average fee, and poor Mr. Howe didn't know why. He didn't have the confidence to charge the full prices. He would offer discounts to customers, and so this film that they developed, it wasn't on how do you earn the fee and deserve it. It was just, you need to be more self-confident as a preparer because you're trained, you're the skilled, you're not just being paid for the half hour that a customer is spending with you. You're being paid for all the training hours and all of the preparation, all of the schooling that you've gone through to get to that point. As an aside, I'll say that, so I love Closing the Sale, and I love that, and that's been proven to me and to our company and to our companies over and over again, that's the way to build value for our customer, is during the interview, you talk to them about what you're doing for them. Sometimes it's giving them advice about their children or IRAs or business, or using their automobile and mileage, or charitable. I mean, you're constantly, you're a guide and a counselor to a customer, and so you earn your value. And I learned a long time ago that you don't need to beat your competitor in both the price or service, and you just need to beat them in one. And there's no value in beating them in price, because someone will always undercharge you, even if they go out of business. So I learned that we need to charge more and be worth it. And now I love it. I mean, one of the misdirections and one of the problems with a company like that, in my competitors like H&R Block and Jackson Hewitt and now Liberty, they've all over the last, well, since I left Liberty 6 years ago, they've had 5 different CEOs. In the last 25 years, both Jackson Hewitt, and since I left, and H&R Block have had a dozen CEOs. So they average less than 3 years on the job, and they didn't learn that lesson. So they came up with this exactly incorrect philosophy of charging about 4 years ago at H&R Block. And I say I feel like sending H&R Block a thank you letter every day, but at least once a week, if not every day. And what they did is they decided that transparent fees up front would attract more customers. And so what they do is they tell you, we are going to, before we start your return, we're going to tell you what the fee is. So when you think about what I learned, and the way to establish value is that 30 minutes that the preparer spends with the customer in all aspects of it, in digging for deductions and giving them advice and telling them, explaining about the return. They're wasting that half hour. You don't have a chance to build value. And so that the average fee is $200 and almost $60 today at H&R Block. And so you quote a customer $260, he doesn't really understand the value. And so many are going to walk away because they don't understand the value that you're going to build during that 30 minutes with the customer. And so they're going about it in exactly the wrong way. And I just say, thank you, H&R Block. But again, valuable lesson learned when I was in 1971. But I didn't really take full advantage of it until we came out with that film called Closing the Sale in over 30 years later. So next year, so at the end of the season, my boss gets fired, and I had hair like this, even maybe worse. My hair, when it gets long, gets up. And I wasn't a hippie, but I looked like a hippie. And the new regional director that Gunderson reported to was a Bible-toting, very straight-laced, and so he didn't like me. So I didn't get promoted. So now again, I played. There was a Rathskeller, University of Buffalo, played poker, made money, collected unemployment, again bumming around. And I taught tax school in the fall in 1971, and came back during the season and learned another valuable lesson. I went, knowing the ropes now, I went to the biggest office in the country, and they had the biggest office, not in the country, but certainly in the city, and one of the top in the country. And there was 3 full-time day preparers and myself, and the office manager was a woman. And I came in, and back then in the front office, they had one phone on the 4 desks out front. They had one phone, and I made the mistake of sitting in the place with a phone. Well, she came in very quickly and sort of reprimanded me, said, "That's my desk." And I was so happy, because subsequently, when a phone call came in, she was routinely on the phone, and you were paid on commission. And you would do a tax return and be ready to get the next tax return. During the busy periods, there was always customers waiting. And so, but she would get stuck on the phone, giving a price quote or answering a customer's questions about a tax deduction. And so her ability to do tax returns fast was impaired because she was stuck with a telephone. And here I was thinking, when I started, what a great idea it would be to sit, or it'd be fun to sit by the phone. Big mistake. And one of the things I did that almost no one did, we had a receptionist. And when I did a tax return, in order to do them more quickly, I would leave off the name and address and phone number, and I paid the receptionist, I forget what I gave her, 50 cents or $1 per tax return. I would give her, because she didn't have a lot to do, she would take my paperwork, she would take the W-2, and I would list it in one place, but you had to do it on the federal tax return. You had to list the address on the receipt, on the state, and on each form you had to put the name and social security number. And so I had a sort of an assembly line where I would do the basics and put in the key numbers, and then she would finish the return for me. And so I was doing an unheard of amount of tax returns before computers, and today almost no one does this. I was doing 1,000 returns by myself during the tax season, making I was one of the highest paid preparers in the country. And I was offshoring some of my work to the receptionist to fill in names and addresses and phone numbers. So I was, of course, others in the office were jealous of me. One thing that was interesting back in the early 70s, the three other, I was 23 years old, and the women that worked with me were in their 40s, and you would think that some people most of the customers were in their 40s, 50s, or 60s, and you would think that they would want to have the more mature people in the office, the women, do their tax return. But there was this, in the early 70s, there was still a stigma that men versus women. And so I got more people that wanted the man to do the tax return than wanted someone older to do the tax return. There was less of an advantage being older than there was an advantage in being a man. Of course, that has changed in 50 years later. That's changed, and it's equal or in favor of women today. But back then, it was an actual advantage. And so, again, I went through that. And so I went through tax season 72, 73, 74, and 75. And again, I was lost in the desert. I hadn't found ready to go. Gordon and I looked at buying a H&R Block franchise, existing office in Canandaigua, New York. But I hadn't found myself. And then finally I was promoted on September 26th of 75. I became a district manager. I finally grew up, finally matured. And then I went to work and learned some more lessons. And I invented some of the processes today back in the 70s that were different back then. And I invented them. For example, one of the things that I invented, this was really my office supervisor, Diane Comfort. She was in one of my offices, and she said she had this one customer, and the average fee now is up to about $17 or $17, $18, $19 in 76, 77. And she said, I have this one customer that keeps referring people to me. Can't we do something for him? Like, can we give him like $5 for each person he refers? And so I sent that to my regional director, and one word answer: no, we cannot pay a referral fee. And so when I started Jackson Hewitt in 1983, I mean, we bought it August of 82. First thing we did is had a referral fee. And then it took H&R Block many, many years to copy that referral fee. But now everyone has a referral fee. H&R Block, Jackson Hewitt, Mom and Pops, Liberty, ATAX, everyone has a referral fee. But I invented it in the 70s with Diane, listening to one of my top preparers, top office supervisors, and but wasn't able to implement it. Another thing I invented was what we did at Block back in the 70s is when we would put all the tax returns where customers had come in January in one file, and we'd separate January from February, from March, from April, because customers tended to come in about the same week they did the year before. So if a customer came in last year on January 25th, then this year they'd come in typically sometime between the 22nd and 29th. And so what we did is we took them out as the customer came in. You would grab his file so you could get information needed to do this year's return, and then you would put them together and send them back to processing. And both the previous year return and this year return would be filed in different spots. But when a customer hadn't been in by within 2 weeks, so let's say that the previous year they had come in on February 2nd, and now on February 16th they hadn't been in yet, we would call them and we'd say, we're just calling up, we'd like to schedule you an appointment. And most of the time they had already filed their tax return, and it could be for whatever reason. Oftentimes it was poor service, or they were unhappy with the service, the price, something that had happened during the interview. And so what I said is, why wait until after the customers? I mean, this is obvious. You would think it's very obvious that why wait until after the customer didn't show up to schedule an appointment? Why not call every customer in advance? So if they came in February 2nd, you call them a week in advance and invite them to come in. That way, you're going to get a higher retention, because sometimes you're going to get a situation where you're going to be able to save a customer where he was going to go somewhere else, and you're able to talk him through it. I mean, maybe you have to give him a discount. Maybe you have to just listen to his situation. But you're definitely, if you call him before instead of after, your retention rate, if you're anywhere near competent, your retention rate's going to go up. So 1 year, and they didn't take my advice in the year that I invented it, but 2 years later, they came out with a national program, and everything they did was they would make the mistake of coming out with national programs. They didn't realize most of the time they didn't test things. They should. I learned a long time ago not to ever do something that isn't proven on a national basis. So they rolled it out poorly. They rolled out phone power, and it was called phone power. And they would have a central call center, and you would call every customer in advance. And they just did it so poorly because they did it untested, unproven, poorly. But still to this day at our offices, our ATAX offices, we call our customers in advance and invite them back. And you don't want to call them too early. You don't want to, if they're not going to come until April, you don't want to call them, unless you're going to call them more than once. You don't want to call them in January. You want to call them in late March and invite them back. You want to call them back 2 weeks before their likely time to return. And so we still do that and learn that. And it was a change of process that we did. But speaking of lessons learned, this is when I was a district manager, I took a huge risk. They came out 1 year, they decided that, again, they rolled out things nationally without testing. And they asked this question. Some new guy came in and he asked this question: how long does it take to do a tax return? And the obvious answer is it takes less than an hour. And so therefore, they decided nationally in their infinite wisdom that we needed to schedule only an hour per tax return labor in our offices, because nationally we were averaging about 2 hours per tax return. And because that included things like dead time, answering the phone, giving price quotes, making corrections, et cetera, research. And so historically in my career, when they came out with that program about 1978, it was my 9th year. They said, you need to schedule your only 1 hour per tax return. Now I had big offices that were doing, the biggest one was doing 4,000 tax returns. So even though last year we made a lot of money with labor with 7,000 hours in the office, 1.75 times the number of tax returns, I was supposed to cut it down to 4,000 hours. So, and every year I admire my boss in one way that, I mean, as silly as it was, every year when he came back from national headquarters with their newest idea, whether it was phone power or one return per hour is all you can, because they were going to save a third of their payroll. They were going to save so much money. They were going to save. They were so in belief that they were going to save millions and millions of dollars of payroll by cutting it down to 1 hour, that we were incompetent out in the field, only getting it to at best 1.75 hours per return. And so I was at a district meeting. My boss always came in and like, he believed it hook, line, and sinker. He either believed it or he did a great acting job of showing that he believed in the company program and that we were going to do this. So again, this is back before computers. And back then you would send in a week in advance, you would send your schedule into your boss for approval. And it was snail mail, you didn't have email, and you would send it in advance, and then he would approve it and send it back. Well, there were 18 district managers, and 17 managers followed that program and sent it in and said, okay, if on the week of January 21st, we're going to do 100 returns, then we're going to schedule 100 hours. And I sent it in the same, what I knew was going to happen, that it was going to, if I'm going to do 100 returns, it's going to be 175 hours. And so this is the kind of renegade or self-confidence that I had. I sent it in the right way. He sent it back to me all marked up in red. He said, you need to change this to 1 hour per return. And I sent it back to him and they said, it's impossible. And he could have easily fired me because I was totally not doing what he said. But I'm not going to go through the gamemanship like all the other 17 district managers did and pretending to that we're going to be able to make 1 hour per texter and then not being able to meet it and missing. And we're going to do a poor job of managing the office because if you're understaffed, then customers are going to be waiting. And my philosophy, I learned long ago that if there's a customer waiting in your waiting room more than 15 minutes, then it's going to cost you one customer per every time someone waits over 15 minutes. And we actually invented, when I started Jackson Hewitt, we invented a discount. If you waited more than 15 minutes, you got a discount because you're either going to lose that customer for failing to return, or you're going to lose referrals, or you're going to have people coming, looking in the door and seeing all the people waiting and just not wanting to get into that line. I mean, how many of you have never gone up to a drive-through and seen 30 cars, or went to a restaurant and had an hour and a half wait and said, I'm not staying, I'm going to go somewhere else? You're going to lose business if you have people waiting. And so by understaffing, everyone else in the country was losing customers. So could have been fired, wasn't fired, fortunately. And a couple of years later, I went on to become a regional director. And I was promoted. And actually, here's a story of my belief is God, family, and business. And I married a woman in 1977 with 3 girls, and they were from 11 and 10 and 5. And the H&R Block came out with a program which I thought was a good idea, but didn't end up not working. And since I wasn't involved in the program, I'm not sure why it didn't work. But they had about 550 district managers like myself, and about 35 regional directors that handled about 18 district managers each. And they invented, I thought was a really good program, that they were having lots of turnover at that time. They were growing very rapidly. When I was there, they grew from 3,000 offices to 9,000 offices. And what I've learned in all my companies, and I've almost always been involved in chaotic or growth, incredible exponential growth. And I learned that it's always chaotic. And so they would have to replace regional directors and district managers every year. And they came up with a philosophy that let's pick the best. We're going to need about 5 new regional directors every year. So let's get the best district managers in the country, about whatever it was about, let's say it was 50 of them, and bring them in every quarter to Kansas City for training and advice and mentorship. And then when we need the next, that we're building our already pre-trained new regional directors of the future. And so they came to me and said, even though my boss's wife was a district manager and he kept trying to get her promoted to be a regional director, he picked me also to join that group. Well, because I had these children that I had inherited in my marriage, I thought about it, and I could not leave, because if we left, their father was living in Elmira, New York, and we wouldn't be able to take the children out of state or out of the area, because they had to have the father had to have visitation. So I reluctantly, even though that was my dream ever since I was interviewed in 1971, I just wanted to be an H&R Block regional director. I turned it down, and surprisingly, 2 years later, I get a call in in April of 1980. Harry Buckley, the country was divided into three: the central, the west, and the east. The 9,000 offices were a third, a third, a third. And Harry Buckley, the regional or the divisional director of the east, called me up and said, "Would you be interested in going to Philadelphia and being a regional director in Philadelphia?" Well, there was a couple of good things about that. Now the girls are getting older. They're the oldest is going into high school, and Philadelphia is only a 4-hour drive from Elmira, so we can easily go back and forth in the commute to Elmira. And actually, long story, I won't get into it, but we didn't have custody of the girls at that time, so the father had custody, and we would just get to see them on every other weekend. So that wasn't hard from Philadelphia. So it fit right in, and turns out that it was an interesting situation. That why was I considered when there was this whole system of 50 trained district managers who were going in every quarter for this training? Why did they tap me and say, "Would you be interested?" There's only two reasons that I can think of. And years later, Harry Buckley went on to become the CEO of Block. And then after he left Block, he called me up and we met in April of 1996. We met, I flew him into DC from Kansas City, and I drove up, and we met, and I brought him on board. He had been fired by Block, and I brought him on board as a director of Jackson Hewitt. But I asked him, I said, "Harry, do you remember why you hired me?" And he was a Harry, wonderful man, but not a great memory, and he did not remember. I can only think of two things. Number one is they had a psychological test that you take it's the only time that I ever got one at H&R Block, and they sent it out in November or December one year, and I'm sure that I aced that test. That I put in what I thought they wanted to hear, and I'm sure I aced that test. I'm a test taker. I do great at tests. I'm sure I aced that test. So it might have been that I had a high score on that, or one thing I did one of the lessons I learned when I became a Block district manager, they had a roving IRS commissioner that they would hire. IRS commissioners only lasted about 3 years, and then they would hire a retired IRS commissioner to be a roving ambassador and go around the country. So I had one of them come into Elmira, and your job is to set up publicity to radio shows, TV shows, newspaper interviews. And I had done a I had learned from him the ability to spin that I see so much in politics, where when they asked him a question, he would sometimes answer the question and then add what he wanted to add. So he would say, and by the way, we're open year round, or whatever he wanted to add to the question. And we solved that by opening year round. So I saw the skill involved in that and the brashness that you needed to have in dealing with the media. So again, about that time, I won several national public relations awards because I was in a perfect place. You got points for television spots, newspaper articles, radio spots, and those types of things. You got points, and I happened to be in an area that had 20 different there were 20 offices in about 16 cities. I was in Elmira, New York, that handled Ithaca, Corning, Bath, Cornell, Watkins Glen, Sarah, Pennsylvania, and I had all these little newspapers. And there was a flood there, and it's a great tax deduction. And so everyone, when there's a national disaster, everyone's looking for an angle. So I was the tax guy and set article after article and did spot after spot. So not only did I win the national award a couple times for district manager with the most publicity, but back then, the Wall Street Journal every Wednesday used to have 1/6 of the front page, one column was on tax. And one year I saw that the the author that wrote the article made a mistake on New York State, that he said New York State was handling this in this way. They had changed and they're handling it this way. And so I sent him a note, and he called me up and asked me to explain. And I explained to him, and he said, I'm going to check this out, and I'm going to check it out. And if you're right, he said, I'm either going to publish your name and give you credit in the article, or I'm going to call Henry Block and say he's got a guy in Elmira, New York, doing a great job. So he didn't put my name in the article, and so he might have called up Henry Block and said, you got this guy in Elmira, New York, you need to pay attention to. And that may have been the catalyst that got me promoted into being a regional director. And so being brash and being out there and going for the gusto, learned that was incredibly important. One lesson I learned as a regional director, and I'll finish off with this because there's so much learning, but Harry Buckley was my boss. And, I went to training in Kansas City, new regional director training, and they came up with this foolish training that back then they weren't going to train you. They just started this process, but you were going to learn from a facilitator. So I went to training with about 8 regional directors from the United States and Canada. 2 were from Canada, 6 from the US. And we would sit in a room, and this facilitator would ask us questions, and we would discuss it. And I finally, at the end of the training, the COO, Dan Pack, came in with the director of training and said, well, what did you guys think of this training? And I said, where's the beef? I want to know what I can do. I want to know, what kind of permission do I have to do to get a lease approved? Or how much money can I spend? I don't know we didn't learn the nuts and bolts of this job. And so they listened kindly and didn't do anything. But last thing I learned in November of my 1980, my manager in Wilmington, Delaware, called up and said, I got a deal. The Chrysler plant will let us give, and the average fee now is up to about $30 or $35. The Chrysler plant is willing to pass out to all of its employees, perfect customer base, blue collar customer, perfect customer base. They're willing to give a $10 coupon to each of the employees. So I had learned that I couldn't do that. So this is a great idea. So I said I approved it as my regional director, not knowing what I could and could not approve because I hadn't been trained on that. And I'm always going to go. I'm always going to be as assertive and aggressive as I can without violating the law. It wasn't violating any laws. It was a great marketing program. So what happened is it was hit the season, and that was the edge of my region, and I only went to Wilmington, and south of Wilmington were some franchisees in another region, and they got coupons. Now, 80 or 90% of the coupons they got were from new customers that came in. It was very effective, but they got some from existing customers who were getting $10 off. So I got scolded. Harry Buckley, my boss, didn't call me and scold me. I got a scolding from Dan Pack, called up and scolded me for, don't you ever do that again. Don't you ever do that again without permission. Give out $10 off coupons. So again, many lessons learned. Had a great time, and again, finally grew up and got going in the right direction. And 2 years later, I was off and running with Mel Jackson and Jackson Hewitt. Thank you for your time, and everyone have a great day.